Volume 23 opens with Feldway dragging his nearly shattered body, fleeing in shame toward the Star Palace by using instant teleportation. Even though his flesh had been torn to pieces by Diablo and the pain was unbearable, arriving at the Star Palace gave him a brief, fleeting sense of relief. It was worth noting that only a handful of beings were capable of teleporting directly into the Star Palace. Normally, the only access point was the Celestial Tower, guarded by de Gruel. But with Ivarage and the army of cryptids now disrupting that passage, breaking through the Celestial Tower had become virtually impossible. Theoretically, the Star Palace remained a zone of absolute safety. Staggering toward the throne, Feldway tried to reassure himself. If he managed to buy just enough time, his wounds would eventually heal. Diablo's strength had far exceeded his expectations, so much so that it seemed outright abnormal. Yet Feldway was convinced he would win in their next confrontation. He believed he had unraveled Diablo's combat patterns, and he had also learned much from observing Yuki Kagurazaka's techniques, especially his use of instant teleportation in real combat. No matter how powerful Diablo seemed, Feldway still refused to view him as a true threat. However, one fear remained anchored deep within him: Demon Lord Rimuru. Feldway had not yet discovered that Diablo's newfound power came from Rimuru. Instead, what tormented him was an instinctive fear toward that slime who had managed to return from the very end of space-time itself, an event that defied all comprehension. More importantly, it meant that Feldway's ultimate attack, Chronosaltation, had completely failed against Rimuru. This skill causes time to flow only around the targeted individuals, creating a distortion where the temporal stream collides with frozen space. The resulting backlash hurls the target into the temporal flow at an accelerated speed while the world around them remains frozen, flinging them through time and space, potentially reaching the very end of space-time. This skill imposed incredibly strict activation conditions. Yet Rimuru had brushed it aside without the slightest effort. Muttering to himself, Feldway desperately wished Rimuru had been erased at the outermost edges of time and space. Meanwhile, he continued down the shattered corridor, heading straight toward the throne. However, when he lifted his eyes toward the throne, the scene before him nearly stopped what was left of his chaotic breathing. The hall was not empty. Gino, Pico, and Gracia, who were supposed to be attacking Ramirez Labyrinth, were nonchalantly lounging on the seats beside the throne. Their relaxed attitude made them look like tourists just returning from vacation, not commanders in the middle of a war. Worse, they were wearing mocking smiles and commenting on how miserable Feldway looked, joking that he must have taken quite the beating. Feldway, who had already learned of Vega's defeat during his battle against Diablo, swallowed his rage and pain, demanding to know whether the trio had come crawling back like beaten dogs simply because Vega had lost. But Gino's response sent Feldway's blood pressure soaring again. He claimed that conquering Ramirez Labyrinth was an impossible mission. Not only Vega, but even Insector King Zelanus, who was supposed to be invincible, had been taken down by Zegan. It was nothing less than devastating. Although Feldway had mentally prepared himself for Vega's failure, knowing the man's arrogance and unreliability, he had always viewed Zelanus as his trump card. With existence points exceeding 100 million, Zelanus was a monster comparable to a true dragon. Feldway had believed that even if Vega were to fall, Zelanus would hold the line, giving him room to salvage the situation. It was only at that moment that he realized just how naive he had been. Almost instinctively, he asked again whether it was Diablo who had defeated Zelanus. Gino corrected him with deliberate emphasis. The one who had killed Zelanus was Zegion. It was like a thunderbolt. Diablo's strength was already terrifying, and now Rimuru had under his command another monster capable of overwhelming Zelanus in single combat. From this short exchange, Gino, Pico, and Gracia quickly deduced that it had been Diablo who left Feldway in such a pitiful state. Naturally, they couldn't pass up the chance to mock him. They began praising Diablo's overwhelming strength and debating whether Zegan might be even stronger. They speculated that Zegion must also be approaching the Catastrophe class, and that it would be difficult to say who was truly the strongest: Diablo, Zegion, and Rimuru, the one who commanded them both. not to mention Milim and other formidable obstacles standing in his way. The enemies Feldway needed to eliminate to achieve his ambitions kept increasing without end. At this stage, he could only rely on whatever chaos Ivarage might manage to create to determine the next phase of his actions. However, before Feldway could even process all this crushing information, Gino's aura suddenly shifted. The usually sleepy and laid-back fallen angel vanished, replaced by a sharp and authoritative presence worthy of one of the 7 original angels. Gino stared Feldway straight in the eyes and declared that the holy relics he had so carefully protected had disappeared, then asked if Feldway knew anything about it. Feldway's heart tightened violently. He immediately turned toward the space behind the throne. There stood the door leading to the underground sanctuary chamber. Its material and construction were as sturdy as the outer walls of the Celestial Tower, originally designed as an impenetrable barrier against all intruders. Yet now, that door had been obliterated. Fragments were scattered across the floor. The staircase descending into the underground was fully exposed, and inside, everything was empty. The sacred coffin that held the bodies of the Star King Veldanava and his beloved wife, Princess Lucia, was gone. This coffin had been Gino's most precious treasure ever since he had retrieved their remains, and the number of people aware of its existence was extremely limited. It was an absolute top-level secret. The coffin itself had been infused with Holy Spirit energy, a divine artifact comparable to the one Luminous once used to seal Cronoa. It should have been absolutely impossible to destroy. Moreover, Feldway himself had participated in the construction of this domain and had reinforced its defenses countless times. It was precisely because of its flawless security that Feldway had once placed his true body there. Both Feldway and Gino initially suspected Ivarage, but Gino no longer cared about sparing Feldway's pride. He bluntly pointed out that this incident was due to Feldway's negligence. If Feldway had not lifted the protective barrier of the Star Palace, the 2 holy relics could never have been stolen. Feldway had no argument to defend himself. If Veldanava were ever to be resurrected, the loss of his body would indeed be problematic. But as an immortal true dragon, he would still be capable of regenerating a form from nothing and returning. The real issue concerned Lucia. She was different. She had been human. A high human, to be precise. Once her body was lost, it meant complete eradication with no possibility of return. What Feldway had protected with the utmost care all this time were precisely those 2 relics. They were his final lifeline leading back to Veldanava. Even though Feldway was convinced that Veldanava had abandoned him and harbored a deep resentment that drove him to extremes, even to the point of desiring total annihilation, deep within his heart, he still longed for his lord's approval. That was the tragedy of Feldway. Feldway cursed the reckless Ivarage, but Gino did not stop there. He sharply noticed something unusual. The destroyed door did not seem to have been forced open from the outside, but rather blown apart from the inside. Furthermore, the sanctuary hall could only be accessed by 2 individuals, Feldway and Velzard. No one else, not even Gino, had access. Not long ago, when Feldway had returned to his true body, this place had still been secure, and Feldway, being extremely cautious, would never have made the amateur mistake of forgetting to lock the door. Gino then cautiously proposed another hypothesis. What if Veldanava had already awakened? Precisely during the brief time window between Feldway's return to his true body and the beginning of Ivarage's invasion of the Central World? Simply because if the door had been blown open from the inside, it meant that someone inside had come out. Indeed, although the door was considered impossible to break from the outside, its internal structure offered relatively low resistance to impacts from within, since the defense mechanisms had been designed solely to counter external threats. Of course, there was another possibility. Perhaps Ivarage had first forced the lock to enter, then caused an explosion while leaving due to a loss of control over her power. Worse still, Ivarage might have absorbed the power of the holy relics while she was inside. But even so, Gino could not completely dismiss the possibility of Veldanava's resurrection. It wasn't that Gino hated the idea of Veldanava's return. He simply hoped that his speculation was wrong, because a resurrection at this precise moment raised far too many red flags. If the world were truly on the brink of destruction as Feldway desired, then Veldanava awakening in response would make sense. But Gino's instincts told him that things were never that simple, and unfortunately Gino's bad premonitions had always proven extremely accurate, 99 times more than his good ones. That was precisely why Gino deliberately threw out the absurd hypothesis of Veldanava's resurrection, hoping Feldway would immediately refute it. Feldway felt suffocated, yet he analyzed the situation calmly. First, the time window between his return to his true body and the invasion of the cryptid army was extraordinarily short. It was unlikely that Veldanava would choose that moment to resurrect. Second, if Veldanava had indeed resurrected considering his personality, he would never have remained hidden. He would never have allowed Feldway to manipulate Milim or attempt to destroy the world. Feldway would have been the first target of divine punishment, even if Veldanava's power had not fully recovered yet. Thus, for once, Feldway and Gino reached a rare consensus. Veldanava had very likely not resurrected, but based on that assumption, an even more troubling possibility emerged. Pico and Gracia were the first to voice it aloud. If that turned out to be true, then the already fearsome evil god Ivarage might have absorbed the powers of both Veldanava and Lucia. Gino could easily imagine how terrifying that would be, and although it gave him goosebumps, he optimistically shrugged it off, waving the idea away with a casual gesture, stating that even if the situation was indeed catastrophic, it wasn't his job to clean up this mess. With a nonchalant tone that sounded like, "That really sucks," he dumped the entirety of the problem onto Feldway. As for Feldway, even though this development aligned with his goal of destroying the world, losing control of the situation was unacceptable. Not only did it mean that his plan to resurrect his lord had completely fallen apart, but it also meant they had created with their own hands a final evil god that even they might be unable to control. Gino, meanwhile, slipped back into his usual not my problem attitude. He lazily asked Feldway what his next plan was, and this indifference infuriated Feldway to the highest degree. It was only then that Feldway realized something. Gino had already escaped the control of his ultimate skill, King of Justice. Gino didn't even bother to hide it. He openly declared that he, Pico, and Gracia had been free from Feldway's control for a long time. The three even displayed mischievous smiles as they stated that they were tired of Feldway, and that they were finally free. Feldway's heart filled with hatred and reluctance, yet he understood that these three unpredictable fools would never tell him how they had escaped his grasp. After all, they had always been whimsical and uncontrollable. Without ultimate domination, it had become impossible to force them into obedience. Moreover, Gino's group didn't even see themselves as traitors to Feldway. In their eyes, it was Feldway who had betrayed their trust by trampling on their free will and manipulating them as he pleased. The trio retaliated without hesitation, each taking turns criticizing Feldway, firmly declaring their complete break from him. The reason Gino's group had come here in the first place was simple. They had heard that Ivarage had appeared in the Celestial Tower, and they wanted to check whether the Palace of Stars was still secure. Unfortunately, their visit only confirmed Gino's notoriously accurate bad premonitions. The holy relics had indeed vanished. At this point, regrets were meaningless. For Gino's team, the situation had already far surpassed anything they could handle. They could only give up on intervening. Fortunately, they at least ran into Feldway here, and having the chance to unload years of pent-up resentment all at once left the trio with an unexpected sense of refreshment. They no longer saw Feldway as an authority figure in the slightest. Now that Rimuru had safely returned to the central world, the trio openly and fearlessly expressed how much they were looking forward to joining the Monster Federation. Then, Gino suddenly remembered something. He casually threw a good luck at Feldway and prepared to leave. Feldway, however, was on the verge of breaking. To him, the blatant defection of the trio was the height of shamelessness, especially given their status as former supreme members of the 7 primordial angels. Yet they displayed no pride whatsoever, and even went so far as to bow to a newly born slime. But Gino remained indifferent to Feldway's rage. He casually remarked that the number of years one had lived didn't matter. If those years were meaningless, then they were worthless. What mattered was how one lived, and only a firm will allow the soul to shine. This line sounded extremely familiar. It was what Rimuru had once told the three primordial sisters during their recruitment. Gino even expressed a hint of pity, stating that Feldway's eyes were clouded by obsession, and that it was time for him to reconsider what his true original goal actually was. Before leaving, the trio advised Feldway to stop doing absurd things like trying to destroy the world, and added that they didn't hate him that much. Left alone, Feldway felt nothing but emptiness. He had lost his friends, his companions, and the master he had pursued for so long was no longer there. Now, even the holy relics had disappeared. At this point, it seemed that his only hope lay in the evil god Ivarage. Yet, he wasn't even sure that relying on Ivarage was the right choice. Feldway had long since stepped onto a path from which he could never turn back. The root cause of all this lay within himself. He didn't even have the right to complain. Deep down, Feldway didn't truly believe that Veldanava would be resurrected at this very moment, which led to one logical conclusion. The holy relics had most likely been devoured by Ivarage. However, Feldway noticed something else. Gino seemed genuinely worried that Veldanava might have been resurrected. If Veldanava truly returned, then Feldway's objective would be fulfilled. But that brought him to the real problem. The evil god Ivarage, whom Feldway believed had devoured the holy relics. Even if Ivarage gained the authority of the creator god and became completely uncontrollable, Feldway believed that it didn't matter. Because from the very beginning, his only goal had been to resurrect his master. Whether it was by controlling Milim or destroying the world, Feldway had wished only for the appearance of Veldanava, for his resurrection, and for him to personally come and stop him. For Feldway, the worst possible ending was not the destruction of the world. It was that Veldanava would never return. Deep within a hidden corner of his heart, Feldway already knew that this was the hollowest and most despairing future imaginable. But at that very moment, a chilling shiver ran through him. He also knew that Gino's ominous intuitions were never wrong. The fact that Gino was this worried likely meant that Veldanava truly could be resurrecting. It had been wretched humans who killed Veldanava, and Feldway's group had been abandoned for failing to protect their master. Humanity deserved to be purged, and if that could contribute to Veldanava's return, it should have been a source of immense joy. Michael thought this way, and Feldway agreed with him, but what if Veldanava's true intention had never been to prevent the destruction of the world? This hypothesis was particularly disturbing. From the beginning, Michael and Feldway had done everything in their power to resurrect Veldanava. Feldway had only considered destroying the world when he was pushed into a corner, and it was precisely at the moment he embraced this extreme thought that signs of resurrection began to appear. This pushed Feldway to wonder whether Veldanava's true objective was, in reality, the destruction of the world. Only now did he realize that he had never truly grasped his master's intentions. His murmurs echoed throughout the deserted Palace of Stars, far louder than he had expected. But the place had long been empty. There was no one left to answer Feldway's ultimate question. Thus ends this first episode. For now, Gino felt a vague yet heavy intuition. The Star Dragon King Veldanava might very well have returned to life, and even this faint certainty was already casting an ominous shadow over the future. As for Feldway, he was beginning to question all his past actions. When he had earnestly tried to resurrect his master, nothing had happened. Yet, from the very moment he turned toward the destruction of the world, signs of resurrection began to appear. It was almost as if Veldanava desired the end of the world. The author seems to be preparing a truly monumental twist in Volume 23, and fortunately, we will very soon discover the definitive direction of the story. As readers of Tensura, we may finally obtain, after years of waiting, the ultimate explanation regarding the relationship between Veldanava and Rimuru, the secret the community has hoped for so long. In the next episode, we will completely change settings and move to the battlefield of the Celestial Tower, where Ivarage will unveil his evolved, terrifying, and entirely new form. If you enjoyed this video, don't hesitate to like, comment, and subscribe. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell to be alerted whenever a new video drops. Your support means a lot. See you very soon for the continuation.